The jungles of Southeast Asia were filled with clever but lethal surprises during the Vietnam War, and in the decades since, danger has continued to lurk for those caught in the destruction.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
Yeah, it's a great quote, and you probably say it all the time when you smell something funny, but man, is it dark. You see, setting people and setting things on fire is an ancient and effective war strategy, and that's what napalm did. The term napalm refers both to a class of thickening agents added to gasoline and the resulting mixture. It can be used in flamethrowers or incendiary bombs, or dropped from the air. The resulting mixture not only burns especially hot, but it sticks, ensuring combustion of whatever it hits. It was actually invented during World War II, and napalm was used heavily during the bombing of Japan, the Greek Civil War, and the Korean War. But it was during Vietnam that it really became notorious. In 1972, 9-year-old Kim Phuc Phan Thi, who became known as Napalm Girl, was photographed running naked in a panicked attempt to escape the flames that stuck to her. The photographer, Nick Oot, saved her by smothering the burning napalm with a blanket. His image won a Pulitzer Prize. Phan Thi became a children's rights advocate, and the public became alerted to the horrors of napalm. Unfortunately, though, its use still remains legal under international law. It was used as recently as 2003 by U.S. forces during the invasion of Iraq. One of the key ingredients in Agent Orange was dioxin, a catch-all term for a class of chlorine-containing toxins. They're extremely poisonous and extremely persistent, meaning they don't easily break down in the environment or in animal metabolism. It can, in fact, remain in an animal until it's eaten, thereby allowing it to move further up the food chain. Exposure to dioxins can cause cancer, hypertension, diabetes, fetal abnormalities, and impaired organ function. North Vietnamese and Allied forces were able to conceal themselves within and draw sustenance from the heavily forested countryside. The U.S. addressed this operational challenge during Operation Ranch Hand, which aimed to strip much of Vietnam of its leafy cover by spraying so-called defoliants over the landscape. These rainbow agents were given color-coded names, and Agent Orange was the most effective and most widely used, accounting for about 60% of the 20 million gallons of herbicide dropped on Vietnam and its neighbors.
One of the consequences of the vast amounts of Agent Orange that were used is that now it constitutes a war crime.
Agent Orange is no longer used by the United States military, but the scale of the operation means that it's incredibly difficult to assess how many service members and civilians were exposed, or how many ultimately died from its effects. The Viet Cong were notorious for their frightening use of booby traps. These days, they're broadly forbidden under international law, but that particular proviso wasn't added to the Geneva Conventions until after the Vietnam War ended. Though booby traps certainly could and did kill people who triggered them, they actually were designed to cause serious but non-fatal injuries, forcing uninjured soldiers to stop and help their injured comrades. Booby traps showcase a vastness of human creativity when it comes to inflicting harm on each other. Punji sticks, made of bamboo or metal, were among the most feared. They were placed in concealed pits into which the unwary could fall and impale themselves. For added danger, the sticks could be covered with poison or feces and were sometimes placed in clusters to ensnare would-be rescuers. Other traps included the swinging mace, a spiked ball that would swing toward the victim when a tripwire was triggered, as well as a snake pit, bullets, and grenades that were activated when disturbed, and spiked bamboo poles that could snap into place and gore whomever was unlucky enough to dislodge them. During the Vietnam War, Indochina was bombed more intensely than any other place in history, doubling even the staggeringly high numbers of World War II. All told, there were 7.5 million tons of bombs fired at targets across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. 2 million of those tons fell on Laos, making it the most bombed country in history on a pounds per capita basis. For comparison, Gaza absorbed only 85,000 tons of explosives in the first year of the post-October 7 war. As the Vietnam War ground on, the United States and its allies shifted from tactical bombing, relatively small targeted strikes, to strategic bombing. These hammered the general infrastructure of the areas in an attempt to cripple production and shock civilians into arguing for peace. American bombers could release explosives from so high that the attacking planes couldn't be seen from the ground, but there was a price for that stealth: decreased accuracy.
It was frightening, but we were still cheering. We were cheering.
The deaths from those bombardments didn't stop when the war ended, since not all of the bombs detonated. Even into the 21st century, explosives are still sometimes found and accidentally detonated by civilians, despite the efforts of local nonprofits to clear the hazardous residue. Sepsis occurs when an infection causes an immune response so intense that it begins to damage the organs. It's one of the leading causes of death worldwide, according to the World Health Organization. In 2020 alone, there were 11 million recorded deaths from nearly 49 million cases, And even that number is likely an undercount, as it's hard to collect statistics from the entire global population. Measures to prevent sepsis largely center on hygiene, sanitation, and basic infection control. Stuff that's difficult to maintain in a war zone. An NIH study of deaths among hospitalized service members in 19 treatment centers during the Vietnam War placed sepsis behind only head injury and blood loss as the top cause of death in surgical patients. It was also the leading cause of death among those who died after the first 24 hours in the facility. Basically, if you got shot or fell into one of those booby traps we mentioned before and got a fever, you were doomed. You probably know how you get malaria, when a mosquito bites you and transmits a single-celled parasite. Not to get too sciencey here, but these parasites have a complex life cycle that involves infecting both liver and red blood cells. Resulting symptoms include cough, fever, headache, joint and muscle pain, vomiting, and rapid heart and breathing rate. Some people experience cycles of illness that seem to resolve only to recur after a period of time. While malaria can be treated, some populations of the parasite have developed drug resistance, and over 400,000 people die of the disease every year. Malaria has affected American soldiers in every war that involved deployment to warm, humid climates where the carrier mosquitoes thrive. During the Vietnam War, over 24,000 service members were diagnosed with malaria, leading to an estimated 392,000 sick days taken and 46 confirmed deaths. That may be a relatively small toll compared to other causes, but with severe cases causing symptoms like convulsions, kidney failure, respiratory distress, and coma, it surely wasn't a pleasant thing to live through. In spite of the Geneva Conventions having barred torture, it still happened. The North Vietnamese argued that foreign troops they captured weren't prisoners of war, but rather criminals, and therefore the Geneva Conventions didn't apply. This interpretation theoretically freed them to treat their prisoners however they wished, and thus many of the American service members who were held prisoner during the conflict were tortured. The length of the war meant that terms in captivity were often quite long themselves, with the longest held captive, Commander Everett Alvarez Jr., languishing for over 8 years.
I like to say that I had the privilege of serving with a lot of heroes.
American prisoners were held in generally poor and unhygienic conditions and provided with insufficient rations, little ventilation, and meager warmth in winter. They were also sometimes paraded in the streets of Hanoi. On one infamous occasion in 1966, authorities lost control of angry crowds and the prisoners were nearly all injured in the resulting chaos. Prisoners were also beaten, sometimes fatally. They had their joints intentionally dislocated, suffered electrical shocks, and were bound in intentionally painful positions, and were whipped with fan belts that whittled away their skin. Much of this torture took place under a soundtrack of ideological transmissions from Radio Hanoi, and POWs were often kept isolated from each other to increase the psychological torment. All told, 114 of the American POWs died in captivity, with many of the survivors suffering severe physical and mental scars for the rest of their days. Initially supported by Vietnam, the Khmer Rouge took the Cambodian capital of Phnom Penh on April 17, 1975, and immediately began killing. If you're not familiar with the entire Cambodian Civil War layout, the Khmer Rouge were the communist side of the battle, rouge being French for red, like Red China. Get it? Only they were redder than even Chairman Mao's government. Their vision of a fully controlled peasant society began with attempts to empty the cities, quash individuality, and break apart families. It then proceeded to include forced labor in pursuit of impossible goals for agricultural production. Ethnic minorities, religious peoples, so-called intellectuals, and civil servants in the toppled government were all marked for torture and murder.
I was forced to kill them. If I didn't do it, I would have been killed myself.
The carnage continued until the unified Vietnam toppled the Khmer Rouge and installed a puppet government in 1979. Nearly 20,000 mass graves have been uncovered from the period. Estimates of the total dead vary, though a 2015 statistical analysis from a UCLA demographer places the likely total at somewhere between 1.2 and 2.8 million. The high end of this range means that nearly a third of the 1970 population was killed. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy has become widely known in recent years thanks to its prevalence among football players, but it can affect anyone who's had their bell rung often enough, and that counts soldiers. Repeated blows to the head, covered under the blanket term mild traumatic brain injury, lead to the deaths of brain cells. Symptoms of CTE include mood disturbances, personality changes, trouble with walking and balance, loss of other motor skills, memory loss, and cognitive impairment. Shockwaves from explosions are the most frequent source of mild brain injuries like those that can cause CTE for anyone in a war zone. An NIH report on the disorder also cites vehicle accidents, falls, training incidents, and recreation as possible ways for these blows to occur. CTE also appears to raise the risk of motor neuron diseases like ALS, as well as Parkinson's, all of which can prove fatal. Unfortunately, for research purposes, CTE can currently only be definitively diagnosed during an autopsy. Suicide is among the leading causes of death in the United States, and this unfortunate trend is especially pronounced among veterans. Statistics from 2018 show that 32 per 100,000 veterans died by suicide that year, nearly twice the rate of the non-veteran population. Many of these suicides occur among older veterans in the 55 to 74-year-old age bracket, although younger veterans between 18 and 34 show the highest increased risk for suicide above their non-veteran peers. Women are at a lower risk of suicide generally, but the additional risk for veterans appears to affect women more severely than it does for male veterans. All told, these grim statistics paint a complex picture that affects people across demographic lines. Specific risk factors for Vietnam veterans include long combat duty, injury, survivor's guilt, and guilt about carrying out immoral acts. For suicides among service members during their tours in Vietnam, researchers also note that their stress levels were high even by the standards of combat zones. Common stressors included anxiety about unannounced attacks and the physically uncomfortable conditions. All of this fear, guilt, and tension could result in unbearable mental states, which sometimes led to suicide during the war or well after the fact. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat 988lifeline.org.